Our next guest isn't afraid of what goes bump in the night. He lets his imagination run wild to create some spooky children's novels. And we also find out how he came up with the character for his huntsman spider, all thanks to his best friend, Hagrid the Hound. Reece Carter, welcome to LGBTI Conversations.
Thanks, Anthony. It's good to be here.
Now, you've got a brand new book out called The Lonely Lighthouse of Elston-Fright. Can you tell us a bit about the book without giving too much away?
Yeah, sure. I'll try without spoilers. So this is a book about a boy called Flip Little. He lives in the lighthouse with his nan, and the lighthouse is in a town called Elston-Fright. Now, Elston-Fright is a town that draws bad magic to it as if by magnet. And for a very long time, the Little family have been responsible for defending the town. But the lighthouse's magical light went out a long time ago. They haven't been able to protect the town. But when a band of dangerous weather ghouls called the Poltergust descend, that doesn't stop 12-year-old Flip Little. He and his friends set out to take on the Poltergust and save the town.
Don't know if the town has been saved because you're going to have to buy the book to find out, I guess.
Correct, yes, exactly. That would definitely be a spoiler if I gave away the ending.
Now, you also grew up in a small town in Western Australia.
I did, yeah. I grew up in a wheat belt town, so I grew up on a farm, the family farm. So I think Tammin was the nearest town to our farm, and it has a few hundred people in it, very, very small.
What was it like growing up as a child on a farm?
Look, as a kid, it was fantastic. I mean, having that much space to run around. I've got a brother and a sister, and we're all fairly close in age. So the kinds of adventures we could get up to on the motorbikes, were endless. It felt like our kingdom. Yeah, it was great. I'm not sure I'd be able to live in such a rural community now, but it was a fantastic way to grow up. And I mean, I'm also sure that growing older, I think I probably would have, eventually craved a bit more of a queer community than was available to me in Tammin. I'm not sure I could go back now.
So were you conscious when you were living in the country younger that you were different to, say, the other boys around in your age group?
It's hard to say. I don't remember having any moments of feeling different when I was on the farm, but I suppose I didn't really start considering my sexuality until I was in high school. And by that stage, I was at boarding school in Perth. So that's probably when I really started considering my sexuality. But then again, of course, do you on some level when you're younger just know that you're a bit different? I'm not sure. But it was really in high school that I suppose that I started to know I wasn't like the other boys.
And the journey of slowly coming out, was that an easy process for you to go through, or did you find some challenges?
I found it really challenging. I mean, this is 20 years ago now, and I would like to think that it's changed now, but the environment at an all-boys boarding school was not a particularly welcoming one for someone who was starting to realise that they might be gay. It was quite a conservative atmosphere. It was a real boys' club as well. Again, I'd love to think that it's changed now, but there was rampant homophobia amongst the students. And keep in mind, you're living with these students. You don't sort of get a break from it at the end of the day. But also, I never felt particularly confident that if I went to any of the staff with any sorts of concerns, that there would be a huge amount of support. It just felt like a boys' club. I think that's the best way to describe it. So I didn't come out until I was out of high school.
And I think that was a period of the time too, because we're talking 80s and 90s here where, as you said, it was a completely different time back then. And it was the same period that I've grown up in as well. And with my school, although I wasn't at a boarding school, it was a pretty blokey bloke school. And I could imagine if you were to be yourself, what would actually happen. It would be pretty horrifying, I think. Homosexuality just wasn't a thing. It didn't exist, I suppose, to most people. So I'm assuming it would have been a similar process for yourself.
Yeah, I mean, in Tammin, actually, interestingly, so when I was still on the farm, didn't have much exposure to gay people at all. I do remember sort of maybe when I 10 or 11, there was a gay couple, two men who they bought a hobby farm and they moved out to Tammin, and they actually ended up running the local pub. And they were very much accepted into the community. I don't know if I can necessarily think Tammin itself was a very homophobic community, but that boarding school environment where you've just got teenage boys, as you say, it felt like being gay was the worst thing you could possibly be because all kinds of slurs were used daily and thoughtlessly. I mean, I learned at boarding school, to shrink myself fairly quickly. I was never probably one of the kids who was most bullied, but that's because I feared being bullied, if that makes sense. So I shrunk myself down, because when you've got that many kids around you using, we all know what the words are. When you hear that daily, it just cements in your mind that, oh my God, gay is the worst thing a person can possibly be. That's how it felt. The environment felt unwelcoming and unsafe. The fact that as I was coming to terms with it, the safest thing to do felt like become invisible and just get through those 5 years of high school. And so that's really what I did. I just had maybe 2 friends that I stuck with throughout high school, and I was friendly with a few of the teachers, but I just tried as much as possible to go unnoticed.
Freedom at the end of the tunnel. Just keep your head down. Yeah, I can totally relate to that. You're not like that. And I'm sure there's hundreds of people out there during that era could totally relate as well.
Yeah, and I remember sort of as soon as I finished year 12, I think I was just so ready to be much more myself that I took a gap year that turned into 5 gap years. I just went traveling and found space and found communities and found people like me where I could breathe more deeply and be myself. And I think I didn't even realize throughout high school how much I was craving it until, I got out of there and just bolted.
It does get better for sure. Now, as a child or as a teenager too, you would be found mostly within the library's reading. So was that a big part of your world?
Huge part of my world. Probably really became a very important part of my world again during those high school years. I was reading before that. I was reading on the farm. I fell in love with books and stories at the age of about 10, but it was when I got to high school, I think that interest really took off. And I had the most amazing English teacher in year 8. Actually, I just received an email from him about 20 minutes before we started recording. But he would see me walking around with a book in my hand all the time. And he said, have you ever thought about writing your own stories? And at the time I hadn't really, because of his encouragement. I got started doing that. I was often in the library. The teacher librarian and the other staff there were very supportive and would let me sit there, and I would just write and write and write.
So some of the books you've written lately have been quite spooky. There's another book that you've got out called A Girl Called Corpse. So was that something that you were fascinated in?
It's funny because when I was a kid, when I was reading books for this age group, because obviously these are children's novels, they're middle grade, so they're for readers about 8 to 12. And when I was part of that readership, I did read a lot of, I wouldn't necessarily call them spooky books, but I loved books that there felt like there was real danger and a little bit of darkness. I think that Roald Dahl books are probably the best example of that. The Witches being a really obvious one, but even Fantastic Mr. Fox. I mean, there's sort of real darkness and real menace that the kid protagonist, the hero, had to overcome. And so I think that's probably what interested me more, was seeing a kid hero, take on real darkness and come out triumphant and hopeful on the other side. And then it's interesting because I've been writing children's fiction ever since. I never really stopped since high school. I probably really decided around the age of 25 that, I want to write a novel and get it published. And I wrote 3 novels sort of back to back, and none of them were picked up for publication. But they were actually, interestingly, they were not spooky at all, to answer your question. They were much more whimsical, magical, academy-style fantasy. And it sort of surprised me that the idea that came along for the 4th manuscript, which was A Girl Called Corpse, which is ultimately the first one I had published, was a spooky one. It hadn't been something I'd considered writing. And in fact, I think the only reason I ended up in a sort of spooky headspace was because after that 3rd manuscript I'd written failed to find a publisher, I was a little bit down in the dumps, as you can imagine. There's a lot of rejection, a lot of disappointment in being a writer, especially in those early stages. And so I was pretty low about it. And then a friend of mine, Tobias Madden, he's another author, he writes for teenagers, and he'd recently got his first book deal. He kind of suggested, look, there's this competition for short horror stories for a teenage audience. Why don't you try that? Like, it's less commitment than a novel. You'll feel a sense of accomplishment having finished a whole story in a shorter space of time, like take a bit of pressure off yourself. And I thought that was a great idea. So I wrote this short horror story for teenagers. It still didn't get selected in the competition, but I really enjoyed writing something a bit darker and more dangerous. And so I think it's because I was in that headspace that the idea for A Girl Called Corpse came to me. Subconsciously, maybe I was looking for a spooky idea that was suitable for a kid's story. And yeah, so that's where that came from. And the Lonely Lighthouse of Elston-Fright is set in the same world, in some ways a continuation of that story.
So what's the process of putting a story together like this? Where do you get your ideas? Because you're obviously writing for a younger audience. So I suppose you've kind of got to get your mind out of an adult mind and into a children's mind. So where do you get the inspiration from?
That is a very good question. And I'm not entirely sure I ever grew up completely. So it's
good answer.
It's not so much a matter of having to pull myself out of a grown-up headspace. I think there's some part of my brain that's always stayed quite childlike, in the sense of always being curious, because I think creativity is curiosity. I think being on the lookout for magic, if that makes sense. So Elston-Fright, the town, is based on southwest WA, and that's where I am now. Whenever I come here, I'm immediately struck by its beauty, but there's also just something magical about the place. And so I suppose when I say be curious, it's looking at a place and trying to find the magic in it, or asking questions about it. So if I'm going for a bushwalk, for example, and a bush shakes to my left, rather than think, oh yeah, that's probably a bandicoot, I ask myself, oh, well, would it be a fairy? Would it be, if it was a fairy, would they be kind, or would they be malevolent, or somewhere in between? What would their motivations be? And so I think that's the key to creativity, and the key to where I get my ideas is just always being on the lookout for ideas and asking questions and being curious and looking for the magic in things.
You're basically Peter Pan.